Hi everyone, welcome to our first lecture in EDUC 65, Foundations of Special and Inclusive Education. This is an introductory discussion on inclusion and inclusive education with the following objectives. First, identifying the foundations of inclusion and inclusive education. Second, reflecting on the status of inclusion and inclusive education in the Philippines. And third, developing projects in relation to the issues and trends in inclusion and inclusive education. As I have said during the orientation and our past synchronous session, the third objective is aligned with your project based and problem based proposal or presentation. So you really have to look out for different information and details that you can use for that matter within all our discussions. Last time, we were also able to conduct this activity in which we tried to break stereotypes, labels, categories, and groups where we've put ourselves into and with which society has put us. So basically, we were able to identify how we were able to identify how unique or different we are as individuals, and we were also able to identify how diverse we are as a group. And through this process, through this activity, we were also able to know each other better. I was able to know you as individuals, and you were able, I guess, to know me as an individual as well. Then, we were also able to focus on what inclusion is and how it is situated in the education system, which gave rise to the idea of inclusive education. To have a brief look back or review of what we discussed, let us look at the following. We stated that inclusion is about shifting the focus from altering disabled people to fit into society to transforming society and the world by changing attitudes, removing barriers, and providing the right support. In short, when we look at this statement, we could define inclusion as a shift or a change of the mindset. From before, our mindset is that disabled people or people with disabilities are the ones that are considered as faulty or they have flaws, so they should adjust to the society. On the other hand, our mindset has changed into the mindset that we or the society as a whole, the world, is the one that should transform itself or change itself so that all types of people could be included. So, this shift in the mindset from before to what we have now is actually attributed to the change in the mindset from looking at persons with disability in the medical model versus the social model. That is an idea I got from Michelin Mason from a reading from 1994, in which the mindset before the medical model looks at the person as faulty, that you have to diagnose what are their disabilities, then you have to label them. This is your disability, you should be segregated, you should be fixed. In short, you should be treated for your ailment. That is how we look at persons with disabilities in the medical model. Basically, the society remains unchanged while we try to fix, with air quotations, fix those who have disabilities so that they could fit to what we think the idea of being normal is. On the other hand, when we look at the social model, which actually brought about the change in our mindset, when we look at the social model, we look at the person as a person that has flaws but still has strengths and different qualities. We don't look at how they are disabled. We look at their abilities instead of looking at their disabilities. Then we try to make resources available for them. We try to make programs, activities with which they could be included. In short, diversity is welcomed and the society evolves and changes. Then, we also discovered how inclusion aims to enable communities, systems, and structures to combat discrimination, celebrate diversity, promote participation, and overcome barriers to learning and participation for all people. And we actually can achieve these objectives or aims of inclusion by providing a continuum of support and services that would include all people. In short, when we were discussing last week, I said that when you think of inclusion, simply think inclusion means transforming society to accommodate all people. That's the short definition of inclusion. So now that you understand what inclusion is about, let's situate inclusion in the education settings or in the education scene. When we situate the concept of inclusion in the education system or in the education scene, what we now have is the concept that inclusion in education means transforming, modifying, changing the education system in terms of content, approaches, structures, strategies, facilities, and materials, and etc., with a common vision that covers all children of appropriate age range and growth and developmental range, and a conviction that it is the responsibility of the regular system to educate all children. In short, when we think of inclusion as situated in education, we think transforming the education system to accommodate all learners. And that actually gave rise to the idea of inclusive education, in which we define inclusive education as an education system that includes all students and welcomes and supports them to learn whoever they are and whatever their abilities or requirements may be. So that is the idea of how inclusion and inclusive education came to be, how they are related. So again, in simple terms, inclusion means transforming society to accommodate all people. Situate that in the education field, you have inclusive education, in which you can say inclusive education simply means transforming the education system to accommodate all learners. After that, we also conducted this activity which aimed to show you how these different concepts about handling persons with disabilities are different from each other. We were able to identify which of the pictures represents exclusion, segregation, integration, and inclusion. This series of pictures and their corresponding words or principles that would explain them actually shows how society's mindset has evolved from excluding persons with disabilities to what we have now, which is including those people with disabilities. And we could explain the picture and their corresponding concepts in simple terms, in which we identified that the first picture, exclusion, that is not inclusion. Because what we did as a society before is to keep children or persons with disabilities out of the school. We excluded them. We set them aside. We tried to differentiate them from what we consider as normal. That is exclusion. After that, initiatives and movements intervened, and that is why we have the concept of segregation, in which people with disabilities are given their own accommodation, their own structures, their own system, which resembles what they consider as normal people have before. But segregation proved to be bringing more harm. Segregation actually gave rise to being more divisive, having more labels, contributing more to discrimination and bullying instead of minimizing them. That's why the concept of integration came to be, the initiative of integration, in which what we did is that we have separate classes that are integrated into the regular schools, and that is the concept of integration and mainstreaming. Basically, you put them in the same location, they share the same resources, but it's limited. There is still a separation within the regular school. You still give persons with disabilities a different treatment as you would give to what you consider as normal. And that concept is still excluding, because even if they share the same resources, they have some things that are similar, you still treat them differently. They still feel excluded even if somehow they are physically together. That's why what we have now is the best option among them all, and that is inclusion, in which we literally make it our responsibility as a society to include all children, all people in regular schools. And who are these children or people that should be included or should be a part of inclusive education? So I placed this diagram or graphic organizer here so that you could have an idea of who are these that belong to the concept of all children. So we have here children in remote tribal areas, or those we consider as indigenous peoples, because they have a different culture. So you have to be able to consider how you could accommodate those different cultures instead of just conforming to a specific culture and living their own. You have to develop plans or teaching strategies or materials with which everyone gets represented, everyone gets included. Then we have the working students, in which we have to make accommodations so that these children or people who are underprivileged in terms of financial capacity can still participate in classes despite the obvious barrier. Then we also have children with disabilities and children with HIV or AIDS and other chronic illnesses, in which we have to really think about it. They have to live with disabilities, they have to learn how to live with these chronic illnesses. Will we still ask them to adjust to society and to live with the possible discrimination, bullying, exclusion that they would face if we do not actually apply inclusive education? No. What we have to do is to help them and provide support so that they could live as easily as possible. Then we also have here girls living in difficult circumstances, in which in different places lots of women get discriminated upon just because of their gender. You could also include here members of the LGBTQIA plus community. Then we also have the children of migrant laborers who actually move from their roots, the places where they actually are from, to places where jobs and employability have higher chances. This creates a community where different kinds of culture are pulled together, and those cultures should be represented in the education system. Then we also have the street children, in which they are forced by their situations and circumstances to be on the streets. We still have to consider them and include them when we are conducting different kinds of interventions when it comes to educating learners. And of course, we have all other children, and they should all be considered and thought of when you are planning an inclusive education program with the aim to potentially meet the diverse educational needs of all children. After that introduction about inclusion and inclusive education, now we will move forward to the foundations of inclusion and inclusive education. First, let's look at the philosophical foundations. As I have stated during the synchronous session, Persons with disability are abused, objectified, and killed. They are considered as a social threat because they are thought of to contaminate the pure human species just because they are different or have their disabilities. However, in the 1950s, ideas about why are we treating these people like this came to be, and that is from the philanthropist who stated that persons with disabilities should be given custodial care. And that is how the concept of institutionalization came to be. Persons with disabilities were placed in asylums where they were fed and clothed. But asylums were not really made to be educational institutions. So basically, when we say institutions like asylums in the period of institutionalization, we just put them in institutions so that persons with physical, mental, and intellectual impairments could be taken care of and treated away from the society. However, when you put persons with disabilities in institutions, you remove them or exclude them from the society where they actually belong. And aside from that, abuses of power within institutions and abuse, objectification, and killing of persons with disabilities are still happening. This situation actually gave rise to the normalization principle. The normalization principle was first developed in Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Denmark, and it is attributed on a paper written by Bengt Nurge in 1969. That paper roughly identifies normalization principle as making available to the mentally retarded patterns and conditions of everyday life which are as close as possible to the norms and pattern of the mainstream society. Basically, in the normalization principle, what happens or what they want to do is to provide a semblance of normalcy to the life of persons with disabilities in a way that they could still enjoy resources and patterns and norms of the mainstream society, but still there are limitations to what you can give them, and you still give them a bit of special or different treatment. That's why it says a semblance, just resembling the patterns of mainstream society. This is why normalization principle is argued to have given rise to the concept of integration. And it is also why the normalization principle can be considered as a foundation of inclusion and inclusive education. However, of course, the normalization principle is not perfect. It has flaws. One example is that normalization principle was not able to consider that there is a wide range of individual differences and there is a ton of diverse possible opportunities that are available for persons with disability inside and outside of the school system. Aside from that, basically it is called normalization principle. So it's still discriminating in a way that you have this idea of what normal is, and you are going to provide that idea of normal to persons with disabilities or those who you consider as different. So still, you have a standard of what you consider as normal. We have to remember, however, that when the normalization principle was first starting in Scandinavian countries around the 1960s to 1970s, provisions for special education in terms of special schools are already existing in different parts of the world. Special schools are actually existing since the 15th century, and this type of categorization between those who should go to normal school and those who should go to special schools have actually just stopped during the 1950s. Since the normalization principle is a pretty new idea or concept at that time, special education is still the prevailing concept. And this is something that is actually considered by some as excluding because persons with disabilities still need to follow a different curriculum as compared to what you call as the normal people who are following the regular school system. So there is a separation of the special education system and the regular school system. Thus, during that time, the idea of integration came to fruition. This is actually a response to the weakness of special education. In integration, you have a continuum of support and services in which you still categorize students, which should go to special schools, which could go to special classes within regular schools, and which could go to regular classes within regular schools, with or without support. So there is a continuum of services, technically. However, again, that idea of special education and integration is questioned because you're still categorizing and labeling people. That is why the inclusive schooling movement came to be. They proposed that the special and regular or general education system should be merged. The inclusive schooling movement does not believe that there is a continuum of services, that there should be people attending special schools, special classes, and regular classes. Instead, there should be only one unified system of education. Thus, the inclusive schooling movement actually proposed to restructure and reform the schools so that all learners could be accommodated. But still, inclusive schooling, we use the term schooling because it is still enclosed in the school, within the school. Inclusive schooling is like relying mostly on the school systems. However, the concept of inclusive education asks for support out of the school. It includes the formal, informal, and non formal sectors of a community and emphasizes universality, relevance, functionality, and the localization of the curriculum. So basically, when we say inclusive education, it is different from inclusive schooling in a way that inclusive schooling is only enclosed and is only enclosed within the school, and you are giving much power and responsibilities to the school that they could not really handle on their own. On the other hand, when you look at inclusive education, it includes the whole education system involving the non-formal and informal sectors within the community, asking for the support and assistance of the whole community. Aside from the normalization principle, which evolved from special schools to providing special education to inclusive schools to inclusive education, we also have these different principles which are considered as the roots of inclusive education. We have diversity, human rights, social justice, and disability rights. And they are advocated and identified by these different authors. I want to zoom in on diversity, in which we could use the concept of the diversity wheel proposed by Marilyn Loden in order to create an environment where, regardless of one's diversity profile, everyone feels welcomed and their skills are leveraged. When we talk about the diversity profile, just look at the picture on the screen. You can see there that Loden identified different factors in which we could look at the diversity profile of individuals. There are two circles here, and Loden proposes that those in the inner circle are things that we cannot really change or may be hard to change. You need a lot of things for you to change those that are inside the inner circle. So why did I want to discuss Loden's diversity wheel? It's because you can use this to identify the different diversity profile of people you know and your students, your future students. You could use this diversity profile so that you could better understand your students and to better plan instructions that would accommodate all of your students. And that is it for the philosophical foundations. Now we will be moving to the historical foundations. The following are the international milestone declarations and conventions which shaped and supported inclusion and inclusive education as we know it right now. The first one, in 1948, is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, in which Article 26 explicitly establishes that everyone, has the right to education. Then we have the second one in 1960, which is the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education, which is technically the first legally binding international instrument which is entirely dedicated to the right to education. It also had its 60th anniversary in 2020. And this convention in education reiterated that education is not a luxury but actually is a fundamental human right. It emphasizes on the assurance of free and compulsory education. It bans any form of discrimination and promotes equality of educational opportunities. Then the third one in 1966 is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which ensures that people enjoy economic, social, and cultural rights, including the rights to education, fair and just conditions of work, an adequate standard of living, the highest attainable standard of health, and social security. The next one is in 1981. It is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which states that measures to eliminate discrimination against women should be conducted in order to make sure that women have equal rights as men in the fields of education, health, and employment, as well as in having a political and public life, including the right to vote and to stand for election. The fifth one is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which emphasized that every child has a right to education without discrimination. Aside from that, I really like this Convention on the Rights of the Child because it provides safeguards to protect children from violence and exploitation. The next one is in 1990, the World Conference on Education for All, or EFA, in Jomtien, Thailand. This World Conference on Education for All, or EFA, in Jomtien, Thailand, actually came to fruition since a large number of vulnerable and marginalized group of learners were excluded from education systems worldwide. Jomtien reiterated that education is a basic right for all people. It recognized that particular groups were excluded and stated that an active commitment must be made to remove educational disparities, and groups should really not suffer any discrimination in terms of access to learning opportunities. Aside from that, the Jomtien Conference resulted in the adoption of the World Declaration on Education for All, as well as a framework for action that focuses on meeting basic learning needs. Technically, the conference was able to expand the goals, visions, and missions of education systems so that activities and services in public and private sectors could be focused on achieving the basic needs of people within and outside of the school. The Jomtien Conference also has this principle of overcoming inequalities and eradicating poverty through education. It only does not aim to provide equal access for basic education, but also aims to improve the quality of education. The Jomtien Conference in 1990 established Education for All goals, which should be achieved 10 years later, which is in 2000. Those goals are the following: expansion of early childhood care and development, universal access to and completion of basic education, improvement in learning and achievement, reduction in the adult illiteracy rate, expansion of provision of basic education and training in other essential skills, and increased acquisition of knowledge, skills, and values required for better living and sound and sustainable development. Later, we will see whether the EFA goals were achieved by 2000. The seventh one in 1993 is the Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities, which ensures that people with disabilities should exercise the same rights and obligations as others. Technically, It establishes that it is the responsibility of the state to take appropriate actions to remove obstacles that are preventing persons with disabilities from exercising their rights and freedoms and making it difficult for them to participate fully in the activities of their societies. It includes statements about equal participation in terms of accessibility to education, employment, income maintenance, and family and personal integrity, basically ensuring that persons with disabilities have the same opportunities as persons without disabilities. The eighth one is in 1994, the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs Education. The Salamanca Statement establishes that schools should accommodate all children regardless of their requirements, needs, characteristics, and interests. It also states that the society should be able to provide a continuum of supports and services that will match the continuum of special needs encountered in every school. The ninth one is in 2000, the World Education Forum, which was conducted in Dakar, Senegal. This education forum was conducted to establish the results of the 1990 Decade of Education Goals or EFA goals presented during the Jomtien Conference in Thailand. Aside from presenting the results of the Decade of Education, it also aimed to develop and adopt a new framework for education in order to continue the EFA goals because by the half of the decade, it has been obvious that most participants of the World Education Forum were not really able to achieve most of the established goals in 1990. That's why the following goals are laid out in the Dakar World Education Forum, and they are called the EFA goals that should be achieved by 2015. First, we have expand comprehensive early childhood care and education. 2. Access to good quality, complete, free, and compulsory primary or basic education. 3. Provide learning needs and life skills of all young people and adults. 4. Increase adult literacy by 50%. 5. Eliminate gender disparities in primary and secondary education. And 6. Improving the quality of education and ensure excellence for all. The World Education Forum report of the Dakar Forum is more comprehensive and more measurable as compared to the goals established in the Jomtien Conference. The 10th one is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which states that all states should ensure an inclusive education system at all levels and lifelong learning. The purpose of the convention is to ensure and protect the equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedom by all people with disabilities, and to promote and respect their inherent dignity and individual autonomy. Basically, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities seem to be banking on the different or the previous milestone declarations and conventions, specifically the standard rules on the equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities. Then, the 11th one in 2007 is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which states that indigenous people have the right to all levels and forms of education without discrimination, wherever that type of education is possible and in their own culture and provided in their own language. Then, of course, the last and the most recent one in terms of World Education Forums is the EFA 2030 that was declared in Incheon. The EFA 2030 is more detailed and comprehensive as compared to the previous EFAs in 2000 and 2015. It outlines practices on the national level up until the local or community level on how you could implement the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically on education. The Sustainable Development Goal number 4 is what it really targets, which is quality education. The SDG number 4 states that inclusive and equitable quality education should be ensured and lifelong learning opportunities for all should be promoted. And how do we do that? The EFA 2030 Declaration and Framework for Action actually has answers to how are we going to achieve that main vision. And we have here bullets 4.1 to 4.7, which are the specific goals of EFA in 2030. And then we have bullets 4.8 to 4.C, in which these are the things that we have to do to achieve the goals that we established. Let's enumerate the different goals of SDG number 4. We have first, quality primary or secondary education for all. Second, early childhood and pre-primary education. Third, equal access to TVET and higher education. Fourth, skills for decent work. Fifth, gender equality and equal access for all. Sixth, youth and adult literacy. And seventh, sustainable development and global citizenship. As I have stated earlier, bullets 4.A to 4.C are suggestions or recommendations on how we are going to achieve the established 7 bullets in achieving SDG number 4. First is to provide safe and inclusive learning environments. Second is to provide scholarships for higher education. And third is the professional development of teachers. And that is actually it for the foundations of inclusion and inclusive education. So we just discussed it in terms of philosophical foundations and historical foundations, in which, when you think about it, philosophical foundations is a more general, idea-based, philosophy-based, concept-based discussion. On the other hand, the historical foundations is a more technical discussion which focuses on milestone declaration and conventions which shaped inclusive education as to where it is right now. In terms of inclusive education, let us now focus on it on the next part of the discussion. We have stated earlier that when we say inclusive education, this is an education system that transforms itself to include or accommodate all types of learners. So now that we know about that and we have established that, we have this question right now as to why is inclusive education important? We have these 3 cases, the educational case, the social case, and the economic case as stated by UNICEF in 2017. We have the educational case because all children learn more effectively when they are subjected to inclusive education. On the social case, inclusive education contributes to more inclusive societies, which is technically a global commitment of states that are part of the United Nations and also those who want to participate in forming an inclusive world. And the last one is the economic case. It is cost effective, or technically we can say that inclusive education is good for economics. That is based on the researches of Lamikane and Mizunoya. They were saying that inclusive education is good for the economy because it actually streamlines the societal system and mobilizes all people so that they can all be included in the economy. So basically, when you look at it, inclusive education is challenging at the moment, yes, because we are still trying to establish it. But in the long run, the challenges and the hardships are outweighed by the benefits that we would reap in the long run in terms of implementing inclusive education. However, even if we establish that inclusive education is important, there are still lots of hardships and challenges, as I have stated earlier, that we have to face. Those barriers in inclusive education include a negative approach because yes, it is very challenging to implement because there should be an overhaul of the whole society and the whole education system. There is also a lack of physical facilities, lack of funds, lack of trained teachers, social discrimination, emotional problems, and educational problems. In the annual review of inclusive education implementation conducted by the United Nations, it actually showed that the progress in terms of legislation and policies are the only things that we could consider as a bit good or moderately good in status at the moment. We still have a long way to go in terms of our attitude in terms of inclusive education and how we are going to collect data or information from states and nations that implement inclusive education. And they also identified that there is a serious weakness in inclusive education in terms of teacher training, the accessibility of each school, and the learning materials that should be provided or used. So basically, there's already a good progress in terms of the national level, international and national level in terms of policies and legislation. However, the key weakness and issues can be found in the implementation at the school level, which is why different studies are conducted on how should we really approach inclusive education or what is the inclusive approach to education. This is one of the recent suggestions based on the Sub-Education Policy Review Report Inclusive Education in 2021 by the UNESCO. The Philippines is one of the countries that are included in this report. So if you want to look at this, here is the link where I found the information. So this is the inclusive approach that the UNESCO is recently proposing. 1. Getting all children and youth in regular public schools and mainstream systems and all illiterate adults in literacy programs. 2. Inclusive education is not only concerned with initial enrollment, regular participation, and grade promotion. It should also consider the long-term achievement through the quality of education provided. Then number 3, require both an analysis of the cause and drivers of exclusion and the proactive searching for and targeted support to those excluded. Number 4, the restructuring of school culture policies and practices to meet the diversity of students, and looking at inclusive education as not an outcome that could be perfectly achieved. Inclusive education should be looked at as a process that is always in process or always in progress, because inclusive education can still be considered as a new concept in terms of the approach of the society as a whole. And as I had said earlier, we really still have a long way to go in terms of implementing inclusive education. There are really efforts that are being conducted towards a more inclusive society through inclusive education in the coming years. So these are the roles of a teacher in inclusive education. Interact with the family, develop new learning strategies, develop self-confidence of students, provide inclusive materials and facilities, look after the students' needs, recognize students' interests and hidden talents, and inculcate positive attitude in able-bodied students. Upon identifying the roles of the teachers in inclusive education, let's look at some suggested teaching strategies for inclusive education. 1 is use universal design principles and differentiated instructional strategies if necessary to create accessible classroom. When we talk about universal design principles, it acknowledges that all learners do not learn in the same way. That you have to understand as a teacher how each student learns, what they need to learn, and why they need to learn it. Which is why you have to really make a connection with your students and understand what their needs and interests are. Then, use a variety of instructional formats. Know your students, as I have said earlier. And lastly, develop a behavior management plan that you could use for your class. Earlier, we established that we still have a long way to go in terms of the implementation of inclusive education. So now, here are some suggested strategies to improve inclusive education. First, we have mainstreaming. You will ask me, why mainstreaming? I thought that's already an outdated idea. You have to really look at that mindset in that specific order: exclusion, segregation, integration or mainstreaming, and inclusion. Okay? People and each community would really have to go through that process. Basically, mainstreaming is like the next step before you reach inclusion. That's why it's a strategy to improve inclusive education. Then, provision of required resources. This is very important, but yes, there might be issues in terms of where to get resources and how to fund those resources. Then we also have to improve our textbooks. They should be aligned with inclusive education principles, not only in terms of the content but also on how it approaches the students. Then we also have special training to teachers and improve methods in teaching, and of course encourage your students to implement and adopt inclusive education principles. As a closing slide for this part of the discussion, which is a focus on inclusive education, we have to remember that inclusive education is a dynamic process which is constantly evolving. As is stated in the UNESCO 2021 Sub-Education Policy Review, it is a process that is always in process. We cannot really see yet a specific product or outcome that we could say, yes, we have achieved inclusive education. Because when we say inclusion, we have to constantly think of how we can improve, how we can include all students. And as of now, we are really far from including them all because the percentage of excluded students or learners and or people are still overwhelmingly large.